My name is Kylia. I am the assistant manager of Slope Pleasant Hill, and I am so excited to be talking today with Glenn from the Golden Gate Bird Alliance. So, why don't you introduce yourself, Glenn? And I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you, to everyone today. And I'm glad to have a nice crowd here online. I am also zooming in from Pleasant Hill today, even though our offices are in Berkeley. But I'm definitely an East Bay boy. I was raised here in Livermore, and although I was in New York City for 25 years, I'm really thrilled to be back home in the East Bay. Um, so I'm going to be sharing a little bit about how you can make your garden safer for birds, because we both want to have birds in our yard and make sure that they thrive in our yards. And I am the executive director of the Golden Gate Bird Alliance. The Golden Gate Bird Alliance was founded in 1917 as the Audubon Association of the Pacific, and we've changed our names a few times, but we're now the Golden Gate Bird Alliance, and we are affiliated with the National Audubon Society, and we work on bird conservation across the Bay Area. We work from the Farallon Islands to Yosemite, Mono Lake, all over Northern California. And I'm really excited to share this information about our gardens. My own garden is a very bird-friendly garden, and it will actually be on the Bringing Back the Natives garden tour tomorrow. Weather holds up. So here we go. Get this started here. There we
Can I
go.
interject real quick, Glenn?
Yeah.
If anybody who's watching the webinar has any questions, we do have a Q&A below. You're welcome to put your questions there, and we'll have a session at the end of the presentation where we will address any questions that have been dropped in there. Anyways, go ahead and take it away, Glenn. Sorry.
Okay. Nope. It's easy to forget how to do that. All right. Again, I'm Glenn Phillips. I'm the executive director. Because I did that already. So I'm probably, if you're here, you are here because you already care about birds. But just as a reminder, that birds are in trouble. Right? Our bird populations are declining significantly in North America and around the world. Right now, the latest study found that there were 30% fewer birds. A third of all of our birds are gone. Of the some 500 plus species in North America, about almost 400 of them are vulnerable to climate change. And there are a lot of things that happen in our landscapes that people do that are quite dangerous for birds and are causing population declines. Right, 1 in 4 breeding birds have been lost, according to the 2022 State of the Birds report. Here's a picture of a burrowing owl. Burrowing owls were once abundant in the East Bay. They're now, there's one location in the East Bay where they still breed. And they used to breed in Livermore. On my way to school, I would walk through what were fields then, and there were burrowing owls nesting in the fields on my way to school. Well, there are houses there now, and so there are no burrowing owls. We are very fortunate in the East Bay to have the East Bay Regional Park District, which is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. It is a really critically important group that does more than anyone to protect land. And you get a sense like there's a lot of parkland here. We have more than most parts of the world, and it is not enough. As you can see, that there, even with all those green spots, there's a lot of it, but there's a lot of empty space in between. And so our backyards can help bridge the gaps between these natural areas. Now, the natural areas are where the birds are going to do the best, but our gardens can really be helpful to birds by providing good habitat, by providing connections between the really prime habitat and in our parks. Right? Parks can't do it alone. 70% of the US is privately owned. 48 in California, it's a little more public land. We have 48% is privately owned. So we have an obligation if we want to have birds in our lives, and we need them because they provide critical ecosystem services. So birds do things like they eat insects, right? So if birds weren't eating insects, then we'd have to use a lot more pesticides, which have toxic effects on fish, on other wildlife, on people. So we really do need all of these services that birds provide. They move seeds around. They actually move nutrients from one system to another. It's one of the really fascinating things about birds is the marine birds, as an example, eat fish, right? And they're taking the nutrients from the fish in the ocean and bringing them on land when they come on shore to nest or to roost. And that's a critically important process for the planet. Without birds, these things stop happening and we're in trouble. So I'm going to sort of separate here the indirect threats, which is primarily loss of habitat, from the direct threat, which are the things that we actually do and have really significant control over in our day-to-day life. And of those, the two biggest threats are cats and windows. So cats kill actually probably between 3 and 4 billion. The official average number is 2.4 billion. And cats, outdoor cats, feral, both feral and free-ranging cats, really do a lot of damage to the environment. We think of cats as, oh well, they'll eat the mice, and I don't want the mice in my house. Well, what's interesting is that when scientists have studied the impacts of free-ranging cats on mouse populations, that what they find is not that the total number of mice declines significantly. Actually, the number of mice stays the same, but the species mix changes. So we go from mostly field mice, which generally don't love to be in our homes, although they will on occasion. I certainly have found field mice in homes. Wood rats have ended up in homes, but what happens when you add the cats to the mix is that the balance shifts and you end up with more house mice, right? House mice are introduced to North America from Europe. They have evolved with cats, so they're pretty good at avoiding cats, much better than our native rodents. Cats have a really significant impact on all kinds of wildlife. And they are the leading cause of nest failure. So in urban and suburban places, when a nest fails to produce offspring, it is usually because a cat got to it. Not always. There are birds that are nest predators. So crows and jays, I know, certainly have seen the lesser goldfinches in my backyard don't always produce offspring because the crows like to eat baby lesser goldfinches, but still the leading cause in urban and suburban places is cats. Glass is the number two, and glass is dangerous because people and birds don't see glass. And so when a person, if I would do this in a room, I would ask you to raise your hands if you've ever walked into a sliding glass door. And usually everybody raises their hands, because I certainly have done it at least more than once even. And when a person does it, right, it's embarrassing if someone notices you doing it. It can be a little uncomfortable. You might bruise yourself, but it's not fatal. Right. For a bird who is flying, head first at that glass at top speed, could be as much as 30 miles an hour, that's fatal. And so birds often they don't survive to learn to avoid the glass. And birds, unlike people, so as a person, you could sort of recognize the architectural clues that there might be a window there, right? You can see the square of a window frame and know, oh, there's probably a piece of glass there. I should know to not walk through it. Birds can't generalize, so they won't be able to see that shape and just know, oh, there's supposed to be glass there. But they can learn for individual paint. So your backyard birds will learn, if they're resident, they will learn that there is glass there, and if they survive the first impact, they won't do it again. So birds aren't stupid; they're quite smart. But you can't learn if you die the first time you experience something. So let's talk about what birds need first. So I talked a little bit about what they don't need, but let's talk about what they do need. Oh, I've got some bird sounds in the background here. This is in the background is the chestnut-backed chickadee. This is one of our most common backyard birds. I had a pair nesting in my carport this year. Yeah. So what do they need? They need food, they need water, and they need shelter. And then they also need us to take advantage of our understanding of those human threats and do what we can to reduce those. We may not be able to stop them altogether, but anything we can do to make them less is good for birds. Not that I had all my beautiful bird songs in here, right? This is a white-crowned sparrow singing with some gulls in the background. It's a coaster bird. We have beautiful birds. In my yard, at least, they're gone for the year. I don't have year-round white-crowned sparrows. They're only here in the winter, and then come April, May, they're flying north to breed. But there are some parts of the Bay Area where they stay year-round and breed, particularly closer to the bay. So what do birds need to eat? Well, a lot of the birds eat seeds, like the sparrows, but almost every upland bird is eating insects for a part of its life cycle at least. And so even this white-crowned sparrow that is primarily a seed-eating bird, you can see it's got a nice big fat seed-eating bill. But when it's raising its young, it is not feeding on seeds, it's actually feeding insects, because the insects really need, the insects provide the protein in a way that developing chicks need. So, a single chick may require thousands of caterpillars or other insects in order to mature. And caterpillars, it turns out, are like the bread and butter for baby birds. So that's like 80% of the diet of a baby bird is a caterpillar of some kind. And so things that we can do to provide caterpillars for baby birds are all good. Termites are another favorite. They're very seasonal. And I can tell you that the termites have this habit of, during certain times of year, they emerge from underground as winged adults, male and female, and they fly off to mate, and the males will then die and the females will then form new colonies. And it's a pretty exciting time for birds when that happens, because there's a lot of protein being spewed out into the air for them to eat. And birds will, in large numbers, will gather to feast on these termites when they emerge. And I can tell you from personal experience that I had this happen actually at my house in Brooklyn. I was watching this flock of warblers. They were gorgeous birds. And like, oh my gosh, they're like right here outside my kitchen window. And then I realized that those termites were coming from my house. And that was a major repair job to fix the termite damage and do that. So I didn't love where they were coming from, but it was still exciting to see all these amazing birds feasting on termites. And here in California, that in the East, that tends to happen in the spring. Here it tends to happen in the fall, during fall migration. So look for that first rain of the year in September, October, November, hopefully. Look for termites emerging in large numbers and watch for what the birds are doing. Of course, there are some hummingbirds that are nectar feeders, but even hummingbirds, right, they are feeding their babies, they're feeding them insects. Hummingbirds actually really love spiders. So you will sometimes see hummingbirds visiting spider webs to eat the spiders out of the spider webs. They also use spider web to build their nests. So hummingbirds really do need spiders. Seeds. So keeping seeds in your garden, you could have a bird feeder. Or you could plant things that produce seeds. One of the favorites in my yard is Hooker's Evening Primrose. It's a native plant, has beautiful yellow flowers. They open in the evening. It will self-sow. So I planted plants out last year. They bloomed all summer long. And now I have Hooker's Evening Primrose just about everywhere in my garden. It's a little weedy, but the flowers are so beautiful that you don't mind. The on the bottom left here is a picture of this is a weed from my garden, and it is the plant is called spotted spurge. It's a weed. It's a weed, and most people would rip it out of the ground and get rid of it. But it has a habit of growing in places where not much else will grow. So it's one of those things that grows out of the cracks of your pavement, but it'll also grow in dry, compacted soils, heavy clay. So if you've got a sort of bare spot in your garden that where you just can't get anything to grow, this plant will grow there. And it's green and it's kind of pretty, actually. It has beautiful purple spots on it. And the big bonus is that this plant produces copious seeds that are beloved of songbirds. So these goldfinches that you see pictured here love the seeds. They usually like to feed higher up on the branches, but when this stuff is in seed, they're on the ground, gorging themselves on spurge seeds. Mourning doves love this plant. I think I had 7 different species in my backyard, all foraging on this plant when it was in seed late in the summer. Grasses like the one pictured on the left were great. Make lots of seeds that the birds love. One of the tricks with grasses is that you have to actually let the seeds stay in your garden. You can't, if you cut them back as soon as the seeds have been produced, because it looks a little messy, then you're actually taking away the food before the birds can access it. So I leave my the inflorescences, the flower spikes and fruit spikes of the grasses on as long as I can, until I'm sure they don't have any seeds, when they really have to look ratty. Like, so I have a grandma grass in my front yard, and I haven't even cut it all back yet, which I should have, like sort of horticulturally, like, yeah, you want to cut it back a few weeks ago, in the early spring, so that it gets a nice fresh crop. But I'm holding on as long as I can until it looks really, really ratty, because the birds are still eating the seeds. So again, caterpillars are a big deal. Insects are essential for all birds during the nesting season, especially even ones that don't normally eat much in the way of insects. And caterpillars are the number one, but all sorts of insects are important for birds. So there are mosquito eating birds like black phoebes, which probably have seen in your yard at least once. They like water, so they're not, if you're too far from water, they won't be there. But there's enough water in this region that any place within a few hundred yards of a creek, even a seasonal creek, you're likely to find them, and they will eat insects on the wing. We have flycatchers also that will eat insects on the wing, and also swifts and swallows are really significant aerial insectivores, we call them, because they feed while they're flying. So this is kind of an interesting chart that I wanted to share. This is a chart that shows the numbers are the number of caterpillar species or butterfly and moth species that are found on different members of the genus Prunus. So Prunus cerulata is the flowering cherry. Prunus avium is the sweet cherry fruits. Prunus serratina and Prunus americana are 2 wild cherries. Now these are both, this is East Coast data, so it's not, we don't have these same species, but it gives you the idea. So look, if you look at the number of species of caterpillars, right? So, Prunus cerulata has 1, 2, 3 species of caterpillars that will feed on it. Prunus avium's a little better, right? Inside this purple, this reddish blob here. So there are 29, 30, 35 species. But look at the 2 native species. So here's Prunus americana. It has 14, 15, 16, 36, 40, 41. Prunus serotina has 124, 144. It's got a lot. Like there are almost 200 species of caterpillars. So that species richness doesn't necessarily translate into increased biomass. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are more caterpillars, because I mean, we've all seen, a garden plant completely devastated by caterpillars. So we know that there can be a lot of caterpillars on one plant, but one of the things that this species diversity does for birds is that the caterpillars aren't all on the same time frame. So if you have one species of caterpillar, what happens is that the eggs are laid, the caterpillars hatch, they forage, they pupate, they become adults, they go on with their life cycle. And for any given species, that tends to happen under about the same conditions. So it's going to be influenced by temperature, rain, and daylight. But given that those 3 things are the same over a broad region, you're going to get a flush of the same species all at once. And for birds, that would mean that you have a feast on, in early April, let's say, but come May, if there's only 1 species or 2 species, there may be no more caterpillars. They may be done. So, having that diversity is really important for keeping a supply of food going throughout the nesting cycle, throughout the life cycle of the birds. And to do that, you really need native plants. Now, I have given this talk for native plant societies and for native plant programs, and and part of the people who are really, really into native plants really just only want native plants, and that's great. If you have fallen in love with native plants as I have, and you want a whole garden filled with native plants, go for it. There's nothing better. However, if you're also like me, and you don't just love native plants, you love every plant. My favorite plant is the one that's blooming in front of me at that moment. So I can't really say no to, I'm at the nursery, and there's a really interesting plant that's not native. I can't always say no. And so what's important is to make sure you have some core important species. Now, sometimes they're called keystone species. I prefer, the people who use the word keystone species to describe these are people who have backgrounds in animal science and ecology, and who come to native plants from that lens, mostly Doug Tallamy, who is a fantastic entomologist. So he thinks of keystone species, but as a plant ecologist, which is some of my background, most plants are not technically keystone species. So a keystone species is one where when you remove that species from the environment, the system stops to function. So a keystone species could be, elephants are keystone species, right? Where you remove elephants, and because they modify the environment, they move species around. They have a very broad range of impacts. So that means that that the whole system starts to not function properly. So alligators in the Everglades are a keystone species. Plants rarely are keystone species because you think about the valley oak. Well, we also have blue oaks, we have coast live oaks, we have canyon live oaks. There are 6 black oak. There are 5 or 6 oak species, and while they're different and they have different niches, they really do share some common functions. And so if you lose one, you still have the other. So there are ripples across the system, but it doesn't collapse in the same way when you lose a single one. And so I prefer to use the word foundation species. Part of the reason that you will hear keystone species used instead of foundation is that in horticulture, of course, when we talk about foundation plants, we're talking about things that we plant close to the house. But of course, in global warming California, you probably should no longer be planting anything next to your house, right? In order to have a properly defended home from fire, you shouldn't have anything planted permanently within 3 feet of your home. That should all be reserved for container plants and things that are much smaller. So I think that we could use this word foundation species to describe those critical species that play an outsized role in preserving our ecosystems. So for trees, the valley oak is really the number one. You can see 155 caterpillar species that are found on valley oak. Red willow is even higher, although it's not such a good landscape plant. I wouldn't really recommend a red willow in your backyard, although there are willows that will do fine. But valley oak is a great plant, and they should be in every yard as far as I'm concerned. And the good news about valley oak is that if you do have one in your yard, love it, cherish it. If you don't have one in your backyard right now, you will, because these are bird dispersed. So the birds will plant one of these in your yard for you. So all you have to do is leave it. Right? When I bought my house and was starting to work on the garden, I brought some landscapers in to help me get things ready, and we were removing all the things that shouldn't be there. And they came up to the valley oak that's in my yard and was like, "Oh, like this tree, like can we get rid of this tree too?" I was like, "Over my dead body, that's the best plant in my whole garden. It's the only one that's really valuable. There was nothing else. Everything else, I had mulberries, I had crepe myrtles, I have cedars. That was the only native tree in my yard. It still is the only native tree in my yard, because that's anything close to a tree size, because trees take a while to grow. So let the valley oaks grow, and you will have in another 50 or 100 years, you will have a magnificent tree in your yard that's going to provide incredible value for wildlife. So there are 2 shrubs that fit in this category, manzanita and ceanothus, and they are both amazing plants. I mean, they're really stunningly beautiful. Manzanita is probably for birds, it's probably more important than ceanothus, even though ceanothus has more caterpillar diversity. Manzanita, in addition to being a great caterpillar source, is a critical nectar source for hummingbirds in the early season, right? Because they start blooming in January, sometimes December. So that for that winter period when there's not a lot else native in bloom, these are in bloom, and hummingbirds love them. And there are tons of great varieties. Howard McMinn is one that I tend to recommend because it's super easy to grow. It tolerates almost any garden condition. It's readily available. I know I've seen it at Sloat, so this is a classic, tried and true native plant. So if you are new to native plants and you aren't sure that you can handle it, you're worried they're too fussy or too hard to find, Manzanita Howard McMinn is the plant that you want in your yard. And you can use it in the same way that you would use things like Escallonia or India hawthorn, that the sort of flowering shrubs that are sort of moderately sized. They don't tend to get super big. There's some of the Manzanita species. I have a Dr. Hurd in my front yard. It's about this big. It will get to be 20 feet tall. so maybe that's not one you want for every purpose, but they're also very slow growing. So I planted it little. It's now this big, and it won't be 20 feet tall for another decade or more. But a little patience. before I move on to the next one, I just wanted to, I highly recommend buying smaller plants when you're planting natives. It has been my experience. I mean, my garden is now 3 years old. That anytime I decided, ooh, I'm going to splurge and get a bigger plant, I have lost every single one of those. And so you can, save a little bit in your pocketbook, and plant a smaller plant. They will adjust to your yard and your soils better. And in no time, they will be as big as the bigger plant that you might have purchased. In my yard, as I said, the front yard I planted out a year ago, February. And so it's really just a little over a year old. And, and almost everything, not everything, like the Dr. Hurd is still teeny tiny, but Manzanita baby bear, which is similar to Howard McMinn, but with pinker flowers. And my kid had a stuffy that was baby bear, so I had to plant baby bear in my yard. And it is, it was started out about 2 feet, it was in a gallon container, and it's now about 4 feet tall, doing beautifully. So you don't have to plant a giant plant. You just have to have a little time. So there's some other. So I mentioned about leaving the seed pods on your plant. So don't deadhead everything if you can possibly not. But it's also a great idea to not blow and rake away all of the leaves. All right. One of the things that happens in our yards is that we remove all of this, what seems like clutter to us, but it's actually important habitat. So there are insects like caterpillars that depend on this leaf litter as a place for refuge. Right? So a caterpillar, most of them, not all of them, some of them will pupate in the tree, but most of them will drop to the ground and sort of burrow into the leaves and then pupate and then emerge as a moth or butterfly in the spring. If there's no leaf litter, it's too easy for birds and rodents to find them. And so you have a much lower survivorship rate for your insects that you need to feed your birds and to keep your garden functioning. And so like this California towhee, that is a ground feeding bird. When you leave the leaves, that gives the insects a place to hide, and the ground feeding birds a place to forage for those insects. So they're going to keep looking until they find as many as they can, even if they hopefully don't get all of them, so that there's a crop for next year. I would talk a little bit about hummingbird. You hear this sound. You may have heard this in your yard before. It's the sound of a male hummingbird doing its mating dance. So this, unlike most bird songs that are sounds that are made by the syrinx or the vocal cords of a bird, that sound is actually made by the tail feathers of the male Anna's hummingbird as it is doing its courtship dance. So they do this crazy thing. You may have seen it in your yard, where they fly up so high that you can't even see them anymore, and then they come diving down at full speed in a little J. At the bottom, they make a little loop, and as they hit that bottom, their tail feathers vibrate, and it makes this little squeak. And that's how the female hummingbirds know that this is a successful and sexy male hummingbird to mate with. So this is a good thing to look for. Hummingbirds, we're really fortunate to have 3 regular species in our community. The Anna's is the most abundant. It's here year round, but we also have Allen's and Rufus hummingbird. And if you're lucky, there are calliope and black-chinned and other hummingbirds, the Costa's hummingbird that sometimes show up in our gardens. There's been a Costa's hummingbird in Berkeley. That's really a bird of the Sierras, but there's one in Berkeley for a year. So you never know. Hummingbirds are nectar feeders. So planting native hummingbird plants, monkey flower, California fuchsia, penstemon. I cannot recommend California fuchsia highly enough. I think it's a spectacular plant. I have about 8 varieties in my garden. They start blooming in late June, early July, and they will bloom until frost, October, November, December, depending on the year. And they are really, the hummingbirds adore them. They are easy to care for. My one piece of advice, if you decide to grow them, is make sure in come December, January, you cut them all the way back. Don't be brutal. Cut them back, because they will get ugly and leggy if you don't, and they will also spread more than you want. Some are spreadier than others. I have a whole lecture I could give about California fuchsia and which ones to plant. I like all of them, so I can't really. Again, it's like my favorite one is the one that's blooming in front of me right at that moment. But given that none of them are in bloom right now, I'm going to pick Everett's Choice as my favorite. It is a low-growing ground cover. It looks lovely now as a kind of mound of soft gray leaves. It's a little on the greener side compared to some, and it's less. It's a little less spready. So I still have, each of those is still in a clump, whereas Catalina, which is the tallest of them, and when it's in full bloom, is magnificent. Is, it's already in 1 year, it's already moving around my garden, and within a few years it'll be everywhere. But I don't care. The hummingbirds love it. They go crazy. I have dozens of hummingbirds. You can feed hummingbirds, and lots of people do. I don't, because there's plenty of food in my yard to keep the hummingbirds happy. I see them all the time. They nest in my yard. They're super happy, and I don't put out a single feeder for them. I don't put out any bird feeders. I don't need to, because there's plenty of food in my landscape. Keep track of time here. Got it. Okay, I'm good. So if you do 1-to-4 ratio, white sugar only and water, like nothing else, no food coloring, no, don't use organic sugar, don't use brown sugar, don't use all of those things. While they might seem like, oh, organic is healthier, organic has, because it's less purified, it has more micronutrients in it, which actually help bacteria and fungi grow. So it spoils faster and can be dangerous for hummingbirds. So you only want to use white sugar, and you got to keep it clean. Don't let it, on a hot day, you might only have the feeder out for a day. You might have to take it in and clean it and replace it, because it can go bad fast in hot weather. In cool weather, you could probably do it once a week, but pay attention, keep it clean, because it is a problem when hummingbirds feed off of non-clean feeders. They get this tongue infection and they will die. If you can capture them, and it's treatable, but capturing a hummingbird, not so easy. It has to be pretty much on death's door before you can do that. If you love hummingbirds the way I do, you don't have to limit yourself to native plants, and there are a couple of great choices. Salvias, aloes are beloved of hummingbirds. Be sure you choose, if you're planting a non-native, be sure to choose one that's not invasive, all right? To choose a plant that isn't going to spread into the natural areas, get out of control, because we don't need more of that. We've already got, California is overburdened with exotic plants. So, there are things we should avoid. I have a whole nother lecture on that too. So feeders, as I said, I don't use feeders, but feeders bring a lot of joy to a lot of people. The research is still inconclusive. There's some research that suggests that particularly in cold winter places, that birds significantly benefit from feeding. But there's other evidence that suggests that feeders spread disease more easily, and so that because they bring birds in a greater concentration than they normally would, they spread disease more easily, and that's causes problems. So if you have feeders, again, keep them clean them every week. And I would recommend not spacing them quite as densely as they are in this picture. spread them out a little bit more, so you spread the birds on your landscape a little bit. And again, you have to worry about one more, water. Water is, and particularly here in the East Bay, right, like of course today you wouldn't know because it's pouring, but usually by this time of year we are done with our rain, and we aren't going to get any more rain until October. And so during these summer dry periods, water can be a limiting resource. In many parts of our neighborhoods, the historic creeks have been put into culverts, and they're underground and not accessible to wildlife. So providing a water source can be critical for birds and other wildlife. Know that if you have a bird bath, it will be used by anything that needs water, which could range from skunks and opossums and raccoons to the songbirds that you are trying to attract. And so it's really important to keep them clean, right? Birds, I don't know why they do this, but there are lots of, turns out tortoises do this too. They have a tendency to poop in their water. Like when a bird is on a bird bath, they will drink, and they will likely defecate before they leave the bird bath, and that soils bird baths very, very quickly. And so you need to keep them clean. It is better to have no water than to have dirty water. So if you have a small bird bath like this, like I have one of these just like this one in my yard, and I clean it every day. And if I can't clean it, on my way to the car, I pass it every morning on the way to work, to the BART station, and I just grab the top and flip it over into the water. So it's like I spill out any water that's in it. If I don't have time to rinse it out and refill it, I just leave it bare, because it is better for them to have no water than for them to have water contaminated by bird feces. It's one of the main ways that the highly pathogenic avian influenza spreads, and we really don't want to be spreading that in bird populations. So keep them clean. Obviously, if you have the bigger your water feature is, the less frequently you have to do that. But if you have a small one, every day. We're now running out of time here, I think. So I'm gonna just briefly say, so when you're designing your garden, think a little bit about the structure of your garden, right? The birds, it's not just, again, about what the plants are, it's also about the forms that they take. So having a dense shrub border somewhere in your yard is a great idea. That birds really like to nest in that dense shrubbery. I have an old rose bush in my garden that part of me wants to get rid of it. I don't love roses. It's not native. It's got all the reasons why I might like to get rid of it. But in fact, it is great habitat because it is dense, it is thorny. And so I had a pair of scrub jays nesting in there a few years ago. I'm sure I'll get, I have Buick's wren like this one in my yard. I'm sure it will nest in that rose bush at some point. So those are really useful things for birds, not just, and again, keep in mind the birds' habits. So, our birds, our peak nesting is March to July, and I said June, to the end of June, mid-July. But there are birds that are nesting from February to August. Actually, there are birds nesting they're pretty much birds nesting year round in our area. But the quietest time for nesting is September to December. So that is the time to prune if you care about birds. So try and get that done before. I know that a lot of local regulations require you to have done your pruning by the end of May or the beginning of June. For fire purposes, it is still best to do it September through December. So do it early. It'll be cheaper because the people doing the pruning are, like in May, they're so busy that they can charge more because everybody's trying to meet the deadline. So be prepared. Do it in September, so you're prepared for the next season, and you'll be good. I think I have one more slide. Well, I think I've run out of time here. So I'm just going to quickly breeze through this so that I have time for questions. Again, we've talked about cats, keep them enclosed. controlled. You can use a leash. You can build a catio, like this is a catio in Berkeley. You can see this cat here. This is a kind of a cool catio because at the top it has this bridge that connects one house to the next. There's the two sisters own the two houses next to each other, and so their cats actually have a way that the cats can visit each other, which I think is adorable. Avoid pesticides and rodenticides. They are really dangerous for birds. Raptors are especially vulnerable, and like that's one of the causes of the declines of burrowing owls, but all raptor species are threatened by that. And it's because what we call bioaccumulation. So that if you think about, an insect gets a little bit of pesticide on it, it might, if it survives long enough to get eaten, it will have a little bit, but that bird is eating a whole bunch of those insects. So it's going to collect all of the toxins from thousands of insects rather than the single dose that a single insect has. And that builds up in the body of the bird and can cause reproductive challenges, outright death, immune system problems. So there's all sorts of impacts. And particularly, there's a class of insecticides that are neonicotinoids, which are particularly bad for birds. They're particularly bad for bees also. And so we like those are the ones to avoid for sure. Like if you break down and you have to use some insecticide, do not use a neonicotinoid. They are the worst, and they really should be banned. They are banned in Europe. They should be banned here. And then again, for windows, particularly if you're feeding birds, you're going to have more birds in your yard, make them visible. The 2x2 rule used to be the 2x4 rule. Now it's 2x2 because hummingbirds are much smaller than most other birds. And we have a lot of hummingbirds here. So a 2x4 doesn't work for a hummingbird. So here's an example of dots on a window. This is feather friendly. I actually just ordered this for windows in my house. I was hoping it would arrive before the migration season. It didn't, but at some point soon I will have these on my windows. There's a product called Bird Savers that has it's basically parachute cord strung up, and they have a great DIY instructions. Like they're more about saving birds than about selling product. So check them out. You can just Google them or whatever search engine you prefer. This is from my backyard. So on the left is the before of, this was my very worst window. This is a tiny window. So it's not like a big gigantic window, a tiny window on my garden shed. But as you can see, it reflects the fruiting mulberry tree. And that fruiting mulberry tree, yesterday, when it wasn't raining, there were about 250 cedar waxwings in that tree. There are a lot of birds in there. So this window, I was like, oh, it's small. It's not a priority. I'll get to it eventually. But in fact, I walked out after the fruiting season, and I was looking at the window, and I could see at least 3 birds had collided with that window. And it's a very small window. So 3 birds in one season is a lot. So now I've treated it with this product called ABC Bird Tape. That's very easy and cheap. It's not very pretty, but it's a garden shed, so who cares? All right, so just to sum it up, plant natives, keep your cats indoors, avoid pesticides, provide water and keep it clean, leave your leaves, treat your windows. And I think this is the most important one, is tell your neighbors what you've done and why, because we really need everybody to do it. If you do it and your next door neighbor has all their windows untreated and their birds are in your yard, they're going to die on their windows. So that's the summary. We can do I have time to do these questions before we?
Yeah, I think you've got some time still, and I only really see 2 questions in here, so I'm going to just fire off the first one. The first one is, are rats a big threat for birds in the Bay Area?
So not that I'm aware of. I mean, rats are really the rats are a problem in that people use rodenticides, pesticides, to kill them. and those rodenticides are quite toxic to birds. So, what happens when you poison a rat is that it leaves its burrow to die because part of the process is kidneys are failing, and so it needs water, and so it comes out in search of water, and then it's easy picking for an owl or a hawk, and so they're more likely to get eaten and therefore cause damage to birds. But no, not directly. Rats don't really eat eggs per much. I mean, they will, but not as much. Squirrels, our introduced tree squirrels are a much bigger problem than rats for birds.
Okay. In that same line of thinking, I have another person here who's asking if dogs are a threat at all, especially because I know you mentioned cats.
Yeah. So dogs are sort of, in our backyards, for the most part, I would say dogs are not really a threat. Most upland birds are, pretty well adapted for predators like dogs. There have been historically wolves and coyotes and foxes, and so a dog is just another canid predator. The one place where that is less true is on our beaches, because a lot of shorebirds really depend on those beaches for stopover sites, and so they need some places that are safe to rest. And while again these are birds were adapted for canid predators that are here naturally, the number of dogs that we have is so much greater than the density is just so much higher. So the birds don't get a respite when we bring our dogs to the beach. You go to Ocean Beach, there could be thousands of dogs on the beach. Certainly hundreds. The last time I walked there were a lot of dogs, and the dogs, were chasing birds, and so that meant the birds couldn't rest, couldn't forage. They had to move on. So that's not so great for the birds. And there are some birds that are beach nesting birds that are particularly vulnerable.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do see another interesting question here asking about do any birds outcompete each other? They're saying that in their example, they have a lot of crows at the school garden and they don't see a lot of other birds in that area.
So crows, are predators. So they will, they eat birds, among other things. Particularly, they love baby birds and eggs. And so it is certainly, as I said, in my yard, I have seen that the crows have, raided a lesser goldfinch nest. They didn't bother the chickadees this year. So the chickadees were successful. It's actually the chickadees this year nested in the same spot that the lesser goldfinches nested last year, and the lesser goldfinches got predated probably by crows, although it could have been the scrub jays. So scrub jays are also nest predators. Is it, these are all native birds, right? So they have evolved together and often have coping mechanisms for dealing with this. That said, because we have changed the landscape by planting exotic plants, by having trash that's accessible, by feeding birds, so all those things that we do may change that dynamic. So I think that if you really stick with a more of a native plant palette, really try to create natural places, even if they're human created. But if you try to really mimic the habitats that you see around you, you'll have less of that because we both provided appropriate habitat for a diversity of birds.
That makes sense. Let's see, I'm going to go through this Q&A real quick, see if there's anything else we can get to quickly. I do have someone asking about the tour that you had mentioned, whether or not it's open to the public, if you wanted to bring that up at all.
So it
Go ahead.
is to the public, but I believe that the registration has closed. It is, but it's called the Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour, and it's every year, usually the first weekend in May. Sometimes it's the last weekend in April, and and it's today they're doing Bayside Gardens. It's in Alameda and Contra Costa County. So today there are gardens from Richmond to Fremont, and tomorrow there will be gardens from Martinez to Livermore on the tour. But check it out. I believe the registration is closed, but it may not be. I'm not 100% sure. I think it closed yesterday. But
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. I've got. Do you have any advice for dealing with neighborhood cats coming into your yards?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I have had a little bit of that in my own yard. I actually trained my dogs to chase cats, which was fine until I got my own cats. So when which are indoor cats, and my dogs have been trained to chase cats away, so they chase our cats, and the cats, of course, win because the cats are much more aggressive than the dogs. But there are some systems that will like spray water. You can put a fence guard on the top of your fence that will make it less likely for a cat to climb over your fence. Just having a secure fence around your yard is helpful, because that will actually deter some cats, not all, but some cats will be deterred. The regular neighborhood cat that is, I mean, it's owned. It's a free ranging cat, not a feral cat. I know who owns it, and every now and then I think about stopping and knocking on their door and saying, "Keep your cat inside. I don't want it in my yard," but I haven't done that yet. That one, the fence is just fine. It's never comes into my backyard. It's only in the front yard. But just the other day, there was a little black cat in my backyard. I don't know where it came from. I'd never seen it before. But my cats, I noticed it was there because the cats were standing at the window hissing at it. They were not happy to have that cat in their yard, even though they never go outside. So.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we all learned a lot from you today, Glenn. I am super excited to share this webinar with, other folks at my store, and I'd hope to learn from you again at some point in the near future.
Have a glorious day. Enjoy the rain, and tomorrow should be a sunnier day. So
that's what we're hoping for. All right. Have a nice night every day. Oh, have a nice day, everybody.